In this lecture, we will be reviewing how air pollution affects the climate, how air pollutants are transported long distances, and how these air pollutants contribute to ozone depletion. Here are the learning objectives for this lecture. By the end of the lecture, you should be able to answer the following questions. How do air pollutants affect the climate? What are the four main greenhouse gases? How do air pollutants affect stratospheric ozone? And what is long-range transport? Because climate is regulated primarily by the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide, processes that concentrate or disperse air pollutants are significant contributors to both air pollution generally and climate in particular. Global warming, from the accumulation of anthropogenic greenhouse gases, is the best known case of air pollution-related climate events. We have already studied the climate-changing aspects of greenhouse gases. In this lecture, we will turn our attention to other important climate pollution interactions. Dust and fine aerosols can be carried great distances by the wind. Pollution from the industrial belt between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley regularly contaminates the Canadian maritime provinces and sometimes can be traced as far as Ireland. Similarly, dust storms from China's Gobi and Taklamakan deserts regularly close schools, factories, and airports in Korea, Japan, and often reach Western North America. In one particularly severe dust storm in 1998, chemical analysis showed that 75% of the particulate pollution in Seattle, Washington air came from China. Here we see some of the prevailing patterns of air pollution transport. Mixing occurs rapidly, and industrial emissions can be quickly carried by winds. Notice the transport of pollutants from the American Midwest towards the Northeast, and air pollutants moving from the oil and gas production areas of the Gulf Coast towards Florida and the southeastern United States. Dust from North Africa regularly crosses the Atlantic and contaminates the air in Florida and the Caribbean islands. This dust can carry pathogens and is thought to be the source of diseases attacking Caribbean corals. Soil scientists estimate that 3 billion tons of sand and dust are blown around the world every year. Persistent and volatile pollutants, including certain pesticides, industrial chemicals, and heavy metals, evaporate out of the soil in warmer countries where they are still used and travel in the atmosphere towards cooler areas, condensing out again when the temperature drops. This process, repeated in hops, can carry them thousands of kilometers in a matter of days. This repeated evaporation, movement, and condensation, repeated in cycles, is called the grasshopper effect. Cold climates are at the receiving end of this process, with measurable concentrations of DDT, toxaphene, chlordane, PCBs, and mercury found in both the Great Lakes and the Arctic. Ingested by fish and other species, the chemicals travel up the food chain, accumulating in the fatty tissue of predatory animals, including people. Some of these pollutants are linked with developmental and reproductive impacts on wildlife and may have similar impacts on humans. The question of whether the EPA should regulate greenhouse gases was so contentious that it went to the Supreme Court in 2007. The court ruled that it was the EPA's responsibility to limit these gases on the grounds that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare within the meaning of the Clean Air Act. The court, and subsequent EPA documents, noted that these risks include increased drought, more frequent and intense heat waves and wildfires, sea level rise, and harm to water resources, agriculture, wildlife, and ecosystems. In addition to these risks, the U.S. military has cited climate change as a security threat. A coalition of generals and admirals signed a report from the Center of Naval Analysis stating that climate change, quote, presents significant national security challenges, unquote, including violence resulting from scarcity of water and migration from sea level rise and crop failure. Since the Supreme Court ruling, the EPA is charged with regulating 6 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. These are gases whose emissions have grown dramatically in recent decades. Long-range pollution transport and the chemical reactions of atmospheric gases and pollution produce the phenomenon known as the ozone hole, a thinning of ozone concentrations in the stratosphere. This phenomenon was discovered in 1985, but has probably been developing since at least the 1960s. Chlorine-based aerosols, such as chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons, are the principal agents of ozone depletion. Non-toxic, non-flammable, chemically inert, long-lasting, and cheaply produced, these compounds were extremely useful as industrial gases and were used in refrigerators, air conditioners, styrofoam insulation, and aerosol spray cans for many years, from the 1930s until the 1980s. CFCs were used all over the world and were widely dispersed through the atmosphere. In the stratosphere, ozone is valuable. The ozone molecule is especially effective at absorbing ultraviolet or UV radiation as it enters the atmosphere from space. UV radiation damages plant and animal cells, potentially causing mutations that produce cancer. A 1% loss of ozone could result in about 1 million extra human skin cancers per year worldwide. Excessive ultraviolet light exposure could reduce agricultural production and disrupt ecosystems. Scientists worry, for example, that high UV levels in Antarctica could reduce populations of plankton, the tiny floating organisms that form the base of a food chain that includes fish, seals, penguins, and whales in the Antarctic seas. Here is an update on the status of the ozone hole over the Antarctic.
Say goodbye to large ozone holes. A new study from NASA scientists suggests by the year 2040, the Antarctic ozone hole would be permanently smaller than the giant holes of today. Since the early 90s, observed hole sizes have been larger than 8 million square miles, with exact sizes changing each year.
The ozone hole is a seasonal thinning of the ozone layer over Antarctica. The ozone hole size varies in part due to levels of ozone-depleting chemicals in the atmosphere.
Man-made chemicals that destroy ozone are transported from the equator to the poles. In the southern hemisphere, they are trapped by the winds of the polar vortex, a ring of fast-moving air that circles the South Pole.
Although levels of these chemicals have been declining since the late 1990s due to the Montreal Protocol, they will remain in the atmosphere for years, affecting ozone levels well into the century.
High in the atmosphere, the chemicals react with sheets of iridescent ice clouds, which trigger the destruction of ozone. In years with warm temperatures, fewer ice clouds form, resulting in holes that are smaller. In years with cold temperatures, more ice clouds form, resulting in holes that are larger. But in order to understand how hole sizes will change in the future, scientists needed a more accurate picture of levels of man-made chemicals in the atmosphere. Using NASA's Aura satellite, scientists determined how chemical levels in the ozone hole varied each year.
With this new information, we can look into the future and say with confidence that ozone holes will be consistently smaller than 8 million square miles by 2040. And that will really be a milestone that we're finally past the era of big ozone holes.
The Montreal Protocol has contributed to the reducing greenhouse gases as well as preserving stratospheric ozone. Because CFCs have high global warming potential and longevity compared to carbon dioxide, controlling these gases is an important step in limiting the anthropogenic warming of our planet. The discovery of stratospheric ozone losses brought about a remarkably quick international response. In 1987, an international meeting in Montreal, Canada produced the Montreal Protocol, the first of several major international agreements on phasing out most use of CFCs by 2000. As evidence accumulated, showing that losses were larger and more widespread than previously thought, the deadline for the elimination of all CFCs halons, carbon tetrachloride, and methyl chloroform, was moved up to 1996, and a $500 million fund was established to assist poorer countries in switching to non-CFC technologies. Fortunately, alternatives to CFCs for most uses already exist. The first substitutes were hydrochlorofluorocarbons, which release much less chlorine per molecule. Scientists hope to eventually develop halogen-free molecules that work as well and are no more expensive than CFCs. There is evidence that the CFC ban is already having an effect. CFC production is reduced significantly since 1988, and CFCs are now being removed from the atmosphere more rapidly than they're being added. In 50 years or so, stratospheric ozone levels are expected to be back to normal. The Montreal Protocol has also helped reduce climate change because CFCs and related compounds are such powerful and long-lasting greenhouse gases. In this graph, we can see just how successful the Montreal Protocol has been in eliminating CFC production. The remaining HFC and HCFC use is primarily in recently industrialized countries such as China and India. In summary, air pollutants travel the globe and spread particulates, volatile chemicals, and gases. The grasshopper effect causes many chemicals to be present far from sources of generation. It is particularly worrisome as it impacts cold regions such as Canada and the Arctic, where concentrations of metals, persistent organic pollutants, pesticides can be dangerous to human and wildlife. Chlorofluorocarbons are strong greenhouse gases, and with carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide make up the primary greenhouse gases. The Montreal Protocol has been successful in reducing and beginning to correct the ozone hole, which is projected to be significantly reduced by about 2050.